So hello to everyone and welcome to our 13th Revolutionizing Healthcare session and our first session of 2022. Today's topic is AI and machine learning for early detection and diagnosis. My name is Nick Maxfield. I handle the Schaar Lab's communications and I will be moderating today's session. I'm also joined by Mihaela who will be leading the session, and we're very lucky to have 6 expert clinicians join us as roundtable panelists. They are Professors Hari Trivedi, Parag Malik, Richard Gilbertson, Tony Ng, Willie Hamilton, and Yorios Liratsopoulos, and I'll be introducing them in just a minute. But first, before I jump into the session, just a quick note about continuing professional development credits. So if you're a UK-based clinician, you can now claim CPD credits under the Royal College of Physicians CPD scheme at the rate of 1 credit per session for participating in these sessions. To do so, I just need to make a quick kind of disclaimer to the effect that this is a non-commercial, no-fee event organized by our lab independently from our research sponsors. We don't have any conflicts of interest, such as financial relationships that would undermine the balance, objectivity, or scientific rigor of these sessions, and we won't use these sessions to promote products or services. Any mention of our research sponsors will be only in the context of the actual academic content of the session, and we'll make sure we acknowledge sponsorship whenever such a mention is made. If you do want to know how to claim credits, please just wait until the end of the session when I'll explain this. Okay, but to give you an idea of what to expect from today's session, as always, our aim with Revolutionizing Healthcare is to build a shared community and develop common language by defining and understanding medical problems through the use of formalisms and by mapping these to AI and machine learning solutions. In our previous session, our focus was on organ transplantation and how AI and machine learning can transform this area. We looked at some specific sub-areas such as prediction, matching, treatment effects, and so on. And we also introduced a demonstrator with some case studies. This time around, though, we're looking at AI and machine learning for early detection and diagnosis. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to describe this as one of healthcare's holy grails. We will be looking at this topic particularly through the lens of cancer as a very good kind of representative and important example. And to break the session down for you time-wise, after my short introduction, I'll hand over to Mihaela, who will give a presentation which sort of sets the stage for the roundtable session. Her presentation will be about 20 to 25 minutes, and we'll touch on some of the key themes and topics for today. We'll then go into our clinician roundtable and Q&A, and this will last about 40 minutes. So if you're watching and you would like to ask a question to either Mihaela or to any of our panelists, please do so via the Zoom chat, just in a way that everyone can see. And also, you don't need to wait until the roundtable or Q&A to ask your questions. You can do this at any point in the session, for example, during Mihaela's presentation in the beginning as well. We would, however, like to restrict our questions to practicing clinicians if at all possible, since you are our target audience. And we'll wrap up the session at about 5:10 UK time. And before I hand over to Mihaela and before I introduce our panelists, I also just wanted to point out that we recently wrote a write-up on the topic of ED&D, which you can find on our website under the impact section if you click impact and then early detection and diagnosis. We see this as kind of the first step in building a unified vision for ED&D, and we share some specific areas where machine learning and AI can help drive transformative change in this important area. So again, before I hand over to Mihaela, please just let me introduce our panelists for today. So we're very lucky to have 6 panelists, and just kind of going through them in alphabetical order from start to finish. We have Professors Hari Trivedi, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Radiology and Imaging Services and the Department of Biomedical Informatics at Emory University School of Medicine. We have Professor Parag Malik, who's associate professor of radiology at the Cancer Early Detection Canary Center at Stanford. We have Professor Richard Gilbertson, who's head of the Department of Oncology and the Lee Cushing Professor of Oncology at Cambridge and director of the Cancer Research UK Cambridge Centre. We have Professor Tony Ng, who's head of the Comprehensive Cancer Centre and the School of Cancer and Pharmaceutical Sciences at King's College London and Professor of Molecular Oncology at University College London. We have Professor Willie Hamilton, who is Professor of Primary Care Diagnostics at the University of Exeter and Director of Research at the CAN Test Research Collaborative, and Professor Yorios Liratsopoulos, who's Professor of Cancer Epidemiology and Group Leader for the ECHO group at University College London. So without further ado, please let me hand over to Mihaela for her presentation, which will kind of give an overview of the area in general. It'll last about 20 to 25 minutes. And again, if you do have any questions for Mihaela or for any of our panelists, please post them into the Zoom chat.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. We really are extremely appreciative of your time. And what I'd like to do in my presentation today is not to present the ultimate thinking in machine learning for early diagnosis, but rather hopefully to start a discussion with you about what machine learning can do for early diagnosis and detection. And like all these sessions in Revolutionizing Healthcare, the focus is to brainstorm together and think how we can bring machine learning to help clinicians. One of the biggest challenges facing medicine today is how to make a diagnosis on a patient. And of course, many diseases benefit from early diagnosis. And often the earlier one diagnoses the disease, the better the outcome. And of course, a classic example is cancer, but this applies to many other diseases as well. And again, what I'd like to do today, together with a few examples, is to brainstorm together with you about the role machine learning can play to help clinicians diagnose disease early. Of course, the area of early detection and diagnosis is a complex. And this is, I would say, very nicely highlighted and portrayed here in this BMJ article that shows the guidelines for diagnosis and referral for cancers. And you can see that it's a very complicated pathway involving a variety of information and leading to very different types of hypotheses. And I would like to kind of summarize what I believe to be current thinking in early diagnosis today. On one hand, we have risk prediction, which segments individuals using population-based risks, which are, I would say, often based on relatively few variables, rarely integrating longitudinal data, so data that contains measurements, diverse measurements, or features and variables of the patient over time. Usually, it is calculated only once. And on the basis of such scores, guideline-driven management of patients is performed, which is often rigid. And many diseases may even lack even such rigid guidelines and protocols. So this is also all predicated upon a quantitative understanding of disease progression, which I would dare say is somewhat lacking. So what is really the quantitative understanding of disease progression and why it's so complicated? Well, there are many complex observations which clinicians need to make and integrate to decide that the patient may develop a particular disease. For instance, there are background risks, family history, demographic factors, genetic and family history, which set, if you like, the offset of the disease. What is the probability that indeed this disease will develop in this patient? But then as more information becomes available, there may be additional signs and indicators that can be used to inform the diagnosis, potentially an early diagnosis. There may be non-specific symptoms and then later specific symptoms. And the challenge here is how can we integrate this diverse, complex, multidimensional, and over time information to infer the hidden state of disease for a patient. Because this is not observed. We only make observations that are driven by the hidden state of the disease, but the underlying disease state is not known, and the probabilities for this particular patient to transit to another state is unknown. Also, the different states through which a disease may pass in a particular patient and the speed at which this is happening is unknown as well. The windows for acting on the patient based on the diversity of information may also vary. And the question here is, can machine learning help with this particular complex problem? And I'm going to provide to you a few ideas, which are by no means complete, to hopefully trigger a discussion with you. As Nick has mentioned, we have put together many of these thoughts in this write-up that is on our website. Let me start with risk prediction, because risk prediction is what is currently used a lot to do early diagnosis and detection. What can machine learning add to this very mature area? First, we can move from population risk to personalized risk. Number two, we can also add competing risks. And this can be done again in a personalized way. These different risks can integrate easily diverse sources of complex information, family history, socio-demographic factors, genetic factors, environmental factors, and many others. They can also integrate multimodal sources of information, imaging data, tabular data, high-dimensional data, as well as text from clinician notes. And what machine learning can provide is building such scores and such risk scores for a probability of a patient to develop a particular disease or a variety of diseases that is more accurate, that comes with uncertainty quantification. So we know how confident the machine learning model was for this prediction for the patient at hand, and also interpretability. Something we don't talk about today, but we have discussed at length in previous Revolutionizing Healthcare sessions, and we will for sure return. Also, what's interesting here is that we can assess personalized value of information. So it may be that for a particular patient, certain sources of information, whether it's genetic information and some, for instance, morbidities and comorbidities, may be the most pertinent information to be used to issue a risk prediction of a patient developing another disease sometime in the future. While for another patient, given their genetic characteristics and maybe environmental risks, yet another information may be pertinent. So it is not only that the risks are personalized, but also the information that is most relevant to be acquired about the patient to issue this risk prediction varies as well. And machine learning can tell us what is the most useful information, most informative information for issuing this prediction for the patient in front of the clinician. Also, non-stop, we are adding new sources of information, and clinicians have diverse sources of information, whether it's genetic, new imaging modalities, or new blood biopsies that can be used by machine learning to issue predictions. So we can have continual adaptation of the risk models, continual learning, and this is not only important because we add non-stop new sources of information, and hence we can generate easily new risk predictions that consider the value of these additional sources of information, but also the patients are changing. For instance, the patient may be smoking more or less over the years, may have, let's say, other environmental risks over the years. Hence, the risks may be changing over time, and the probability of developing certain diseases may change over time. And machine learning is very good at adapting fast to these different sources of information. And one way in which we can do this adaptation and continuous learning is through automated machine learning. I will not talk much about this because this is just a technology that has become quite mature in recent years. But what automated machine learning can provide is automate people like me, the machine learners. How? By using data sets and developing at the push of a button risk scores of all different types. We have developed, for instance, a method that we call autoprognosis a few years back, which we have developed over time. And now we have a tool called Ajutorium that encompasses this research over quite a few years, together with collaborators from medicine. And what we can do then is we can give data sets, at times complex data sets, as well as modeling choices that are built together with clinicians. And then machine learning models through this automated machine learning framework can, at the push of a button, create risk scores for anything that the clinician may want, together with calibration, interpretation, and trustworthiness uncertainty estimates. Let us now go, though, one step further from what machine learning can do to replace, if you like, current risk scores that may be based on more conventional methods. Let us look one step further at dynamic risk prediction, which is unfortunately not too often used in practice today. We can use longitudinal diverse data to forecast risks over time. So I highlight this here in a quite abstract way. We would like to use observations that we have over time to forecast trajectories of health and disease that are personalized to the patient at hand. What type of questions we can answer? Will event Y, for instance, will disease or will a diagnosis of a particular type of cancer happen in this amount of time? This could be formalized as a prediction problem or a time to event problem. What type of observations? This could be diverse observations. Again, it could be blood biopsies, imaging that's acquired over time. It could be clinician notes, GP notes, as well as other tabular clinical data that's acquired about the patient over time. And this is sparse and multidimensional and complex. So we need to integrate both longitudinal information as well as static information about, for instance, the genetic material of the patient. What is nice about that is not only that we can integrate longitudinal information, but as more values become available, as new observations become available, the risk score can be updated regularly and a new prediction can be made. So as the characteristics of the patients are changing, a new prediction can be done over time. So unlike current practice where we often do this risk prediction based on static information, now we can do it based on diverse longitudinal information. And also over time, we can update this risk as more information becomes available. This also provides us with the ability to include previously unused data sets, thereby easily refining the algorithms. Again, we can rely on AutoML methods, this time for such longitudinal data to issue dynamic forecasts. And we have developed tools such as the clairvoyance tool, which again was developed together with the clinician to issue such dynamic forecasts over time. Now, what about personalized screening and monitoring? Ideally, we would like to screen patients in a personalized way. And also, we would like to do that dynamically. So not one size fits all, to say all the patients are going to be screened at age 50 or 60, but rather depending on the risk, as well as the time series, longitudinal information that's acquired about them over their lifetime, we may decide to screen differently and at different moments in time for different diseases of interest. So the question we can answer with machine learning is, what is the value of various types of information being acquired through screening and monitoring? So for instance, a new imaging or a different type of modality of imaging or monitoring over time for this particular disease of interest, this event, for this particular individual. So the type of questions we can answer is who to test, who to screen, when to screen, and what particularly to screen. So different things for different people. So who, when, because maybe we don't want to screen everybody at 50 or at 60, but even after a first screening, even if we decide to screen at 50, shall this person come back in 10 years, in 15 years, in 3 months? When should they be coming back? and what particularly we should be screening. Should we do a blood biopsy? Should we do an imaging test? What shall we be doing given the information we have about the patient so far? A variety of technologies exist in this area related to active sensing that can be very powerful for personalized screening and monitoring. And again, this may change depending on the event of interest. If you want to look at one type of cancer, for instance, as opposed to another disease or another type of cancer. One particular type of differentiation that you can do using machine learning, and this is highlighted here through this dynamic personalized screening in an earlier work that we have done, is that maybe two patients that may look very similar in terms of their genetic risk have very different histories, for instance, of symptoms or of mammograms over time. And because of these different histories, they need to be screened differently in the future, even though their background risks were the same. Conversely, two different patients that may have very different, very similar histories may need different screening because their family history or genetic characteristics is different. Yet another question we can answer using machine learning is what type of modality should we use? Should we use, for instance, a mammogram, an ultrasound, or a combination of those? Shall we do a 3D mammogram? Should we do an MRI? What should we do next? And should we complement it with additional modalities beyond imaging? Then this brings us to the key question. How can we detect disease early? Early diagnosis is more than just event prediction and forecasting, which I've discussed so far. It involves something much more complex, unraveling and dissecting the underlying states of disease progression towards the event of interest, the disease of interest. And again, this is tricky because how many states is a disease progressing in towards a particular diagnosis? How fast is it progressing? How does that change for different patients that may have different genetic offsets or different types of morbidities and comorbidities? How long will a patient be in a particular state? Are two different observations? We may have the same observation in two different states, and we need to be able to disambiguate on the basis of other information. All of that is required, so we need a quantitative disease progression model. And we need to understand better states and staging of disease. So a quantitative understanding of disease progression is needed, and machine learning can offer that. Current disease progression model formalism, as applied in many state-of-the-art medical papers, are of the following type. They are what we call Markov models. We have different types of disease stages, and the probability of progressing to the next stage depends only on the current state of the patient or stage of the patient. So if the patient is in stage 2, what has happened to the patient before that stage doesn't matter. All it matters is that the patient is currently in a particular stage, and hence, what is the probability given that stage to progress to a subsequent stage. There are problems with this. First, it assumes that the staging of disease is observed. And often we do not observe for many diseases, even for cancer, we do not observe accurately what stage the patient is in. Also, these models often one disease at a time. Also, this is population level. So such disease models are based at the population level. And we know that, for instance, based on the genetic risk of the patient, these models may be very different or a particular underlying comorbidity. Also, it's important to realize that the number of stages a disease is passing from. Does it pass through 2 stages, 3 stages, 20 stages? What's the probability to stay in a particular state? What's the probability to move to another state or skip a few states? All of that is unknown and needs to be learned rigorously from data. One step in this direction is to use quite well-known and quite by now well understood models in statistics, such as hidden Markov models. And one advantage of doing that is that we move from the previous case where we use observable states to a more natural setting where the observations are made based on observables, such as genetic information, family history, symptoms, lab tests, vital signs. But the underlying hidden state of the patient is not known and needs to be inferred on the basis of these observations. And that is what we need to learn. So the disease progression is modeled through these states and probabilities of evolving across these different hidden states. That's the reason a hidden Markov model, as opposed to the previous models used Markov models. What you see here that's interesting is that because you're in a particular state of the disease, for instance, state 2, the emission probabilities of observations of different types depend on that particular state. So maybe a certain symptom is very probable in state 2, but not so probable in state 3 or state 4, or vice versa. So because a certain set of observations is more probable in one state rather than another, that enables us to go back and infer the hidden state the patient is in. And the reality is that clinicians are often doing that more or less in their head by looking at different observations over time, and depending on their probabilities and their probabilities over time, they infer the underlying state of the patient. The challenge is, how can a human easily integrate such diverse and complex sources of information which need to be integrated over time, and considering also background risks such as genetic risk? This is where machine learning can help. The trouble is that we cannot just stop here. Our initial models were based on hidden Markov models, but we soon realized that history matters. And just considering the past state is not enough. It also matters how the patient transited across states, how fast it moved across them, the order of the states, and the duration in a particular state. That all matter for progression of disease. Also, these models are of the type one size fits all, and this is again a bad idea because of information such as demographic, environmental risks, and genetic risk, which clearly modulate these different trajectories. So at this stage, we can say, well, can deep learning help? And machine learning, of course, for time series has been very popular and has been used, for instance, for natural language processing, to do translation and many other things. But the reality is that for disease progression and for early diagnosis, these models are not effective because they do not have interpretable structures of disease progression. So deep learning is not very successful for medicine. I often say that medicine is the hardest frontier for the machine learners because of the complexity and requirements it puts. So what we have done a few years back is we married powerful ideas from statistics with powerful ideas from deep learning, thereby creating a blend of the two, have the interpretable structure of hidden Markov models, but allow representations to be learned using deep learning, thereby having the benefits of the two. And this is this attentive state space model that's highlighted here, which has a big benefit as opposed to hidden Markov models, because it overcomes the shortcomings of Markov models. We no longer depend only on the previous state, but the entire history. And you can see that through these arrows, which may refer back to past histories. Also, we are able to integrate in this way the patient context, both the static patient context, such as genetic information, but also over time, clinical events and measurements and treatments, which are shaping the current patient context and may project into the future. How can then early diagnosis be done on the basis of this? We can use such models for the patient at hand by saying, I observe up to time 3 a variety of information, and I am now needing to issue a prediction of the patient having cancer at a particular moment in time. If it is to do that based on current technology, which is just the clinician looking at the screen and issuing predictions, the disease may be diagnosed late, like in this particular case. And what machine learning can do is to help detect this earlier, when the pathology was actually present, by applying models like the ones I just described, and hopefully in the future much better ones, which look at the information over time and at time 3 already say this patient is at very high risk. We need to monitor them much better with different technologies, such that we detect early at stage 5 rather than at stage 7 this particular disease. Finally, we can also potentially intervene. So at times, if a patient is at very high risk, there could be interventions that can be made in the form of a drug, or maybe even better, a particular lifestyle that can help the patient reduce their risk. In order to know whether to give such an intervention, we need individualized treatment effects over time. So this is where machine learning can be trained on the basis of observational data, such as electronic health records and many other sources of information. And we can detect whether a particular treatment, for instance, a preventative treatment, would be better than doing nothing. Will this reduce risks? So the question is, should we treat a particular patient to reduce their risks? When to give treatment and when to stop treatment? This is a challenging problem because this is not a prediction problem like the ones before, but it's rather a causal effect inference problem, where we need to learn on the basis of static and longitudinal data that contains the patient history and predict what different treatments will do to this particular patient. So we need to do counterfactuals. We need to say, what would happen to this patient if we treat in this way, we treat in that way, we treat later or sooner. And this is tricky because it requires us to deal with bias, and we need to learn from biased data sets. We cannot do often clinical trials for things like this. So we need to deal with the problem of confounding. And this is where, again, machine learning can help to solve such causal inference problems by dealing with the biases available in the data set. And here is an example of a methodology where you can detect what will be the value of doing different types of treatment given the current history of the patient and answer what-if questions. Now, we need to realize that many clinicians may need to be involved in putting the pieces of the puzzle together. And another type of thinking where machine learning can potentially help is building teams of clinicians with different types of specialties to diagnose the clinicians faster. Currently in the UK, there is discussion of putting out centers that diagnose clinicians early. And this is often the case in the United States as well as in many other countries. But the question is, which clinicians should be involved to take care of this particular patient to diagnose him or her early? So like a recommender system is trying to recommend to you what movie you should be seeing in Netflix, here a similar machine learning idea can be used to put together teams of clinicians that have unique expertise that's the most pertinent for the patient at hand. So we are recommending using machine learning to this particular clinician, this particular patient, given their unique characteristics, the best expert team. And indeed, clinicians make decisions differently. So there is a lot of variation in practice. And we all as patients want to be seen by the best clinician, which will diagnose us early and intervene in the most effective way. And we know that there is a lot of late diagnosis. For that, we have developed a branch of machine learning, a new branch of machine learning aimed at understanding the gray cells of clinicians with the overall goal of empowering them. And we call this area quantitative epistemology. And one particular application of this quantitative epistemology is understanding variation in practice. And we took this type of technology to understanding why certain patients are diagnosed late with Alzheimer's, while others are diagnosed early. And we looked at the different types of tests that are given to them and when. And we identified biases associated with certain classes of patients, such as certain types of women, which are often diagnosed late, and try to understand why, with the overall focus of understanding variation and empowering clinicians such that they don't let such patients down. So the type of questions we can answer are: how timely is a particular decision of a clinician? What are the beliefs of the clinicians? What are potentially different types of preferences and risks? How over time the beliefs of clinicians may be changing? Can we build tools for clinicians to debug their decision-making when doing diagnosis? And can they collaborate better and more effectively with each other? So I'm very thankful to all of you for joining us today. I presented here just some of the tools that machine learners can build. But we as machine learners do not know about medicine. So I really hope that you, the clinicians joining us today in the roundtable and more generally, can help me and in general the machine learners think about this frontier. And I hope that you can tell us what type of tools we can build, what you find more useful and less useful, and guide us in this journey. Thank you.
So it's time for our roundtable at this point. I think we're a couple minutes behind, so I'll just sort of breeze through the introduction a little bit, but we're very lucky to have 6 expert clinicians representing a number of different but semi-related areas joining us today. I've introduced them at the start of this session, but they are Hari, Parag, Richard, Tony, Willie, and Yurios. And just to explain a little bit about how the roundtable will work. So this is kind of a guided discussion led by Mihaela. So she will ask you, the panelists, a few sort of open-ended questions to start with. And then I think we will kind of open things up a little bit more and see what kind of discussion comes from these questions. But Mihaela, if you're ready, shall we get started with the first of these questions?
Yes.
Brilliant.
So I have outlined here several potential uses of machine learning in early diagnosis and detection. And I want to ask you which ones you find more useful and which ones you find less so, and what did we miss? And I'd like to start with Tony, with whom I have engaged in the past in quite a lot of conversations about this area. And then I will move to our other panelists.
Yeah, thank you, Mihaela. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so just congratulations on a very comprehensive talk. I think from the clinical point of view, I find your dynamic prediction section particularly helpful. You're absolutely right. You know, we cannot just make prediction based on one time point because the disease will evolve. Take lung cancer, for example. We know there are different states of the disease where some people get bronchoscopy and in follow-up, the tumor disappear. So, you know, although you didn't draw arrow in your dynamic model, there are predictably some patient upon follow-up will reverse the state. And we want to understand to some extent as clinician scientists, what reverse that state. So, I mean, that really linked to some of the additional thought, if I may have just one more minute, is about causality. You mentioned causal inference. Some of the things we measure in blood or, you know, bronchoscopy samples, they might indicate something about causality and therefore a link to treatment. You know, can we do chemo prevention and treat those things? The problem is we got too many parameters, too many covariates, and therefore, how do we know which one to treat, even though they might appear in your explainable model? You know, which out of those parameters is actually causal? The final thing I find it really fascinating is your statement about you are treating or detecting one disease at a time, right, for any given patient. That's certainly the state of the art in the NHS. but there's also pan-cancer clinic coming up online. And these are, rapid diagnostic clinic that, detect cancer in vague symptom patients that don't pronounce to be, potentially lung cancer or colorectal cancer. They're just very vague symptoms. I certainly find your methodology very intriguing, whether we can tap into some of the pan-cancer clinic in the future. So those are my initial thoughts, but very, very helpful and very exciting.
Thank you very much, Tony. Parag, may I ask you to give your thoughts, because you, of course, are very involved with many different types of clinicians in the center in Stanford.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So when I look at the list of applications, to me, I think one of the most exciting opportunities is taking advantage of early data. So when we look at how people are diagnosed today, it's usually they've got a cough, they come in, it's these sort of incidental factors that they're not feeling well. And if we could go back and trace a year, 2 years, 5 years earlier to look at symptoms that may have on their own seemed uninteresting, I think there's tremendous value in being able to go into the prehistory to assess, to change the risk. And so I think this follows along with dynamic risk prediction, but really taking into account lifestyle factors. We also have the emergence of all of these little monitoring gadgets that people have now, and interpreting that data is quite complex. And so there are really great opportunities there for incorporating all of those orthogonal data elements, lifestyle factors, diet, in a level of detail that we just haven't been able to do before. One other point that you asked us to comment on, what is missing from this list, and really I think there's a whole set of machine learning tools that are operating not on clinical data, but for instance, reading the scientific literature to identify correlations and gene relationships and biomarkers, and extract from this unstructured data some very useful and interesting things. So I suspect that the machine learning tools will also play a huge role in really helping us get value from data that has been collected over the last many decades in novel ways, to allow us to do a better job of predicting and typing and phenotyping.
Thank you so much, Parag. Makes a lot of sense to me. Willie, if I ask you now, because you, I guess, are one of the people that are faced with this complex early diagnosis when you see patients. Yeah. What are your thoughts about what we could do better, and how can we empower you?
Good. Thanks, Mihaela. Yeah, I'm a family practitioner. So my job is twofold. It's identifying who should be investigated for possible cancer, and the key word is possible cancer. And the second bit I've got to think about is, how do they be tested? Can I test them in my general practice office, or do I have to refer to a specialist? So that's the two questions over me. And the who to test, I could give an example of how powerful Mihaela's type of work is, in that the data sets that I've got that underpin Mihaela's first slide, that ghastly slide of the nice guidance with multiple arrows going all over the place, that's my fault. But I lent my data sets to someone doing a PhD to test run. Very simplistic machine learning on it. And they pushed the receiver operating characteristic curve up from the high 80s to the mid 90s. That might not sound like much, but actually from a patient perspective, that is magnificent. Because if you look at it from the other side, you drop the 13% above the ROC curve down to maybe 5% above the ROC curve. So the patient benefit and the health economic benefit is enormous. So that's the how side of it. The who side of it is relevant too, because we should get ourselves into the position of not just adjust treatment according to the individual and just investigation according to the individual. And we do this in the UK healthcare service, of course, by putting people at low risk on long waiting lists and people at high risk on short waiting lists. But actually, there's different tests. I could do a fecal immunochemical test for someone at low risk of colorectal cancer while sending immediately to a CT scan or a colonoscopy if they're at high risk. So the WHO is very much a place where this sort of work will fit in. Now, what bits are unnecessary? That's a bit strong word. Which bit didn't tickle my fancy in your talk? And it was the stage work. To me, and I'm probably the oldest person in this call, so I'm probably the closest to developing my cancer. I'm actually, if I've got a cancer, I want you to diagnose it. I don't mind if it's stage 1 or stage 4. I do mind, of course. I want it to be stage 1, but I want it to be diagnosed. So actually, once the patient has symptoms, just diagnose the cancer. So it's actually almost better to do a binary cancer, no cancer outcome for your models. Yes, sure, the health economist.
Really, I guess this is a long discussion, and maybe we should have it in a Revolutionizing Healthcare session, because it's maybe a misunderstanding of what I'm trying to present. So these different stages are not necessarily the stages of cancer. So we should, I guess, it's a complex area that I'm still not capable to present it very well. So maybe a subsequent conversation could help me.
I'll pass on.
Help me. Thank you so much. Harry, may I maybe now go to you and then to Yorios?
Yeah, absolutely. Great presentation. Thank you. The thing that jumps out to me the most is, and I think that would be of extreme value, is personalized screening, right? This ability. So I work in mammography, and we've been working on developing a data set of patients at Emory, which is where I practice. And our patient population is 50% African American here. That patient population is not represented in the vast majority, if any, of the trials that determined screening for breast cancer, right? The efficacy, the risk, the decision to do annual screening. And if you look at the existing models that are used, the Tyrer-Cuzick and the Gale models, really Tyrer-Cuzick more, they've been amended several times, but still there's this gap in performance across races, right? And the issue is twofold. One is data availability for these patients, and two is really understanding that, as you mentioned in your talk, one size fits all screening paradigm across patients just doesn't make sense when we have more powerful techniques. So just in the past couple months, Regina Barzilay and Adam Mihaela from MIT published on an AI-based model that can look at screening mammograms and outperform risk 1 to 5 year risk. So really kind of granular risk for breast cancer development by 10 to 15 points compared to the existing models. And to me, that's probably one of the biggest things, is because if we don't, I mean, it's hard to make predictions on risk when you don't have that data, that patient doesn't even come in, right? So getting the right patients in at the right time while conserving resources, and then tailoring screening schedules for these patients on an individual basis, I think is one of many, many areas, but probably that's one of the biggest impacts on scale wise that we could have, because bringing these patients in at the right time, we could catch thousands and thousands of potential extra cancers. So that, to me, that's kind of the area that I think I'm most excited about.
Thank you, Harry. Yorios?
Thanks very much, Mihaela. A fantastic presentation. I enjoyed it very much. So a couple of thoughts from me. I put something on the chat, but I think that's perhaps for another day. And it's about the juxtaposition of the stage of diagnosis with whether the symptom is a specific and alarm one or not. I have a feeling you have answered this already, in the sense that when you talk about earlier late stage, you don't necessarily mean tumor growth, but perhaps disease aggressiveness and potential for the tumor to cause harm. So That's great. I think that was a good thing to have clarified. Now, a few other ideas. I have another thought is that your work highlights the need for good electronic health record data. And I don't mean simply well curated and being accessible and available, which is another issue for another day, but people being able to record the fullness of symptoms in a way that is efficient to the consultation, the electronic health record and system, the interface, the environment during which the consultation happens to be, enabling for a full history, ideally coded history, to be taken. And there are many electronic health record systems around the world that are essentially deserts. They are isolated entities. They don't speak to each other. So I wonder if there is some great gains to be had by perhaps not necessarily the work you do, Mihaela, but more generally from AI contributions to interoperability and making very badly architectured systems to distill more evidence for the work that you do and other colleagues here are doing. So that's it. In a way, I don't know if there's an AI.
That makes perfect sense, Yorios. As a matter of fact, I often say that machine learning is best at doing some of this plumbing. I think that that's not enough looked at in our machine learning community. We often expect perfect data sets and perfect data. And I think we as a machine learning community need to spend much more of our brain power to build more robust machine learning methods, to tools for curating data, cleaning data, aggregating data. So completely agreed.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Two additional quick points.
Maybe I can move to the next session, a question then, if you allow me to.
Go ahead. And just a quick note, I think we only have a few more minutes with Tony as well. So maybe if we can call on him first, perhaps.
Yes. So what types of data do you think will be needed to inform these types of machine learning methods? This is directly building on Yorios' point. And who possesses the sources of data, and what do you think the associated challenges would be? I think to some extent Yorios already posed this challenge, but I'm posing this challenge a little bit back to you. What would be really needed? So Tony, if you are still with us, maybe you can give us your insights.
Yeah, so I'll quickly, before I have to go. So, I mean, currently we are working locally at the Rapid Diagnostic Clinic, as well as tumor-specific pathways, such as lung cancer clinic. So the kind of data you're looking at, you know, for the RDC are symptoms. Symptoms actually very important, right? You know, you can use so machine learning. I know Willie has been engaged with Richard Lee and looking at that side of things. So symptoms really important. Using NLP to actually mine those data, absolutely important. Apart from that, I think the next bit of data, knowing what I do, is imaging, right? Particularly for those patients who don't get a diagnosis straight away, they will have follow-up imaging, such as lung CT, etc., etc. So capturing the longitudinal images is very, very important. Finally, you know, we are sort of in a time when in the UK, Grail is doing pan-cancer tests and every other company is coming to the UK because we got the NHS. All those blood test parameters, if you can get hold of them, would be very, very important. So essentially everything that you can put your hand on.
Thank you, Tony. Parag, what do you think? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I guess my thought is less about the actual data modality itself and more about the annotations on the data. The machine learning tools really depend on having exceptional labels and for image data, knowing what to look at. So, you know, where is the cancer in this pathology section? And so to me, that would be the focus, not just on volume or type, but really on quality and annotation.
As a machine learner, I cannot agree more, because machine learning is dumb, so it needs to be guided by the clinician's annotated smartness. Maybe if you allow me to shall we go to the next question, and then I return to Yorios, Willie, and Harry, if you allow me?
Sure, let me just share that one.
So we divided these machine learning tools in some of these earlier sessions into patient-oriented and kind of narrow, which we call personalized medicine or bespoke medicine. Then tools that are mainly aimed at empowering clinicians, population health and public health policies, and here where I think ideas such as screening may play a role. And finally, better system pathways and processes, which can really empower healthcare systems, whether it's at the national level, like NHS, or at the hospital level. Maybe, Yorios, I start with you now. Which of this area you think would most be empowered, if you like, or would most benefit from machine learning methods?
Yeah, thank you, Mihaela. I like them all very much, and I'm sure we all like them more. I would say the one that is perhaps under-catered and underserved currently is this, what I call the southeast corner, an AI-informed contribution to system pathways and processes. I think will be terrific. This can involve a lot of things, including, I'm just linking to what I said earlier, making the electronic health record interfaces more, if you want, applying human factors engineering so that the treating teams, in fact, the patients themselves can generate good quality and plenty of data, because a lot of the information currently is not really reflected and phenotyped in the system. And if I'm allowed, as a second dimension in this system pathways and processes, I will also put the stewardship and the curation of the electronic health system itself, the data system. I saw recently, I'm sure you guys know better than me, some AI applications for people writing code, and the code becoming runnable in very foreign, if you want, electronic health record infrastructures. That can be terrific. So I think all four are good, but the southeast corner, very good.
Thank you. Harry, what is your thought? Which of these corners you think would most need machine learners to jump into and empower this ecosystem?
It kind of just in line with the risk of sounding like a broken record. I really feel strongly about the risk prediction, mostly because of the scale of impact. So I think each of the corners are extremely valuable. When you think about the challenges, I think one of the things I think about a lot is, at what point do you just have individual genotypes and phenotypes per patient, right? So how far can we get before you get to the point where every patient is just unique, kind of an N of one, right? And at that point, is it a technical challenge, or do we not have the labs and assays and genetic tests and understanding to even get beyond that, right? We recently.
So this value of information, Harry, am I right? What other information we may need? Are you saying that, or are you saying?
I think it's what other information. Assuming that information even exists, right? Is like how much further down the road do you have to get an accurate prediction on one extra patient? We did this paper on predicting hospital readmissions, right? Using just insurance reimbursement data and predicting a patient's return to the hospital within 30 days from discharge. And you can get up to 70 or 80% because you can easily group patients into kind of large cohorts. But at some point I felt like, we tried for a year developing additional models in this space, and either it's that the data to kind of discriminate against these additional patients is not available, or maybe it's just not possible, right? That each patient is just individually unique and we don't get to that point. And so in my mind, because those challenges are not yet answered, that we don't know if we have sufficient data, or we don't know if it's a technical barrier, I think risk prediction still is something that for the time being has the potential to impact at a much bigger scale. So that's kind of what I'm most excited about.
Thank you, Harry. Willie, what is your thinking across these different areas?
Thank you. And Harry, if you think you are a broken record, I'm going to be worse. But I actually think this will change over time. Currently, I like all four areas. But I think the eastern half, I'm going to be more specific than yours, the eastern half is currently the most important. And I say that because at this point in time, only 5% of cancers in the UK are identified by screening. And therefore, if we improve the Southwest, the population health, and that's why I'm putting the AI improved screening in the Southwest blob, well, it's going to need a lot of work to get that up to be punching its weight up with the other two. So by all means, let's work in the Southwest, but the immediate payoff is in the eastern side. So if I can get better image recognition, so my overworked radiologists can actually see more chest x-rays or see me some more CT scans and be more accurate in doing that. If I can get better selection of patients in general practice, that will be a quicker hit to improve the cancer problem in this country, but they're all important.
Thank you all very, very much for joining us and for this discussion. We're going to try to summarize some of these insights and feed it back to you and then to the community, such that hopefully we can build this discussion forward and outlined the research agenda for the machine learners like me to hopefully develop the right tools in collaboration with you.
Yeah, and I know I promised a Q&A session when I was introducing this session, but I think time being what it is, I will probably take the chat logs from this session and sift through them. And we do actually have another session coming up on ED&D in March. So I think we can bring some of those back into that session perhaps. But just to, before I leave you, just a quick note about our upcoming session, which, as I mentioned, is in March. It's actually on March 10th, same time, so 4 o'clock UK time. And we'll basically be following up on what we discussed today, building on it a little, and we may have a new piece of content related to ED&D, or perhaps building on our existing content to accompany this session as well. And if you do want to catch this session on YouTube, just wait a few days, probably at the beginning of next week. I'll be putting it on our YouTube channel, and that will go out in an email to our mailing list. So please just stay tuned for that. And if you haven't already, please just take a look at the ED&D write-up that we recently published on our website, which, as I mentioned at the beginning of this session, you can find it either in our news feed or under the impact section under early detection and diagnosis. Other than that, I also said that I would tell you how to claim CPD credits. Basically, it's a really simple system. If you just drop me an email at the email address you see here, or the email address, same email address that I send the mailing list reminders from, then I can issue a attendance certificate if you just tell me which sessions you've attended so far. Other than that, if you do have any friends or colleagues that you think might be interested in these sessions, please do let us know. Obviously, we are trying to build a community here, so word of mouth is extremely important to us in doing so. And yeah, just I guess to sort of sign off, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for joining us today in particular. Thank you so much for your time and for your opinions and for your discussions and through reading through what we sent you and engaging with it on such a great level. And I'm really looking forward to our next session in early March. So until then, please take care, stay safe, and thank you all very, very much again.